She was born a princess, crowned before she could bleed, married before she could understand the word love, and dead before she turned 22. In the halls of gold where empires traded daughters like chess pieces, Margarita Teresa of Spain was the perfect pawn. Pure blood, pure lineage, pure sacrifice. They dressed her in velvet, painted her as a child bride, and sent her across a continent to sleep beside her uncle and die birthing his son. Her body, torn open by childbirth. Her smile, frozen in royal portraits. Her voice, lost behind curtains, behind walls, behind time. This is not just the story of a queen. It is the story of a girl turned into a womb, and a womb turned into a tomb. She was born into silk and silence. On a humid July morning in 1651, the bells of Madrid did not toll for war or mourning, but for birth, for hope, for the spark of continuity. The child who entered the world that day was more than a baby. She was a promise, a treaty, a vessel. Her name, Margarita Teresa of Austria, daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his second wife, Mariana of Austria, who was also his niece. That detail mattered, because blood mattered. To the Spanish Habsburgs, power flowed not through armies or conquest, but through bloodlines drawn in spirals. A family tree looping into itself, generation after generation, in pursuit of purity. And Margarita? She was the embodiment of that pursuit. The culmination of incestuous unions, calculated not in passion, but in policy. They called her La Joya de la Dinastía, the jewel of the dynasty. But jewels are mined, pressured, polished, owned. And so was she. Her early childhood was painted in light and stillness. Golden tapestries, silver spoons, a dozen ladies-in-waiting trained to bow lower than her eyes could see. She was the only surviving daughter, the center of every room. The reason why artists like Diego Velázquez were summoned to court, not to paint war, but to immortalize her delicate form over and over. In those portraits, she stares directly at us, pale, proud, posed. But if you look long enough, the illusion cracks. Because her dresses are too heavy, her waist too bound, and her face too solemn for a child surrounded by toys and dogs. Historians say she was intelligent, curious, sometimes moody. Her tutors wrote of her sharp tongue, her precocious Latin, her love of color and fabric, but always the shadow loomed. She was a daughter, not a son. And that meant her body would not belong to her. At just 3 years old, her name began appearing in documents, not in nursery rhymes, but in marriage proposals. To secure the empire, to mend alliances, to hold Austria and Spain in a single fragile hand. One name rose again and again: Leopold I, her mother's brother, and Margarita's own uncle. Did she understand what they were doing? At 5, probably not. At 7, she reportedly asked why no one ever told her where she would live when she grew up. By 9, she began writing letters to Leopold himself, filled with royal courtesy and childhood longing. "Your faithful niece and bride," she once signed. There are no records of her crying, only brushstrokes, and letters from ambassadors describing her as cheerful, dignified, obedient, as if being trained to smile while being sold was a skill. And it was. In her world, It had to be. Still, there were moments of light. She had a small dog named Ayuda that followed her into lessons and prayer. She would sneak candied almonds from trays meant for her father's counsel. On winter nights, she sat on the stone ledges of her window, watching the snow fall on the Plaza Mayor, murmuring stories to her dolls in a voice meant only for herself. Her half-brother, Balthazar Charles, had died before she was born. Her other siblings died young or were too fragile to leave the nursery, so Margarita was alone, but not unloved. The Queen Mother, Mariana, held her closely, not always kindly, but tightly. And Philip IV, though distant, seemed to fear losing her the way he'd lost so many others. She was all that was left of his hopes for dynastic continuity, all his ambition, all his failure, wrapped in a girl too small to wear a crown. When Diego Velázquez painted her most famous portrait, Las Meninas, she was only 5. But already, the center of the frame. Already, the light source. Already, watched by everyone in the room, as if the fate of empires hung on whether she turned left or right. Some say Velázquez captured her essence. Others say he captured her prison. A girl frozen in brocade, in formality, in expectation. And even in that masterpiece, it's not her eyes that dominate the scene. It's what we can't see, the letters being exchanged behind curtains, the treaties drafted in her name, the cradle she would leave behind for a marriage bed. By the time she turned 11, the marriage was official. They told her she was lucky. They told her it was duty. They told her she was born for this. And maybe, just maybe, she believed them. But the child in the painting was fading, and the bride of an empire was beginning to take shape. What no one told her was what her body would become. What no one warned her was what her womb would cost, and what no one dared to admit was that this little girl was already dying by design. She was 11 when the wedding contract was sealed, 12 when the engagement was made public, 13 when the seamstresses began working day and night, and 14 when they said, "Now you are a woman." But she wasn't. She had not bled. Her chest was still flat, her voice still soft with the roundness of girlhood. And yet, the empire had decided. Margarita Teresa of Spain was ready to become Empress of the Holy Roman Empire. The man she would marry? Leopold I, Emperor-to-be. He was her mother's brother, her father's nephew, and now, by design, her husband. It was not a love story. It was a treaty. Spain was declining. Austria was rising. The two needed each other, politically, economically, symbolically. And Margarita was the golden hinge between their ancient doors. The court called it a glorious union. The ambassadors called it a dynastic necessity. But inside her chambers, a girl sat with trembling hands, memorizing the name of a man she had never touched. She wrote him letters, stiff, formal, dictated by tutors. But sometimes, something slipped through. "I hope I may be a good wife to your majesty," she once scrawled in her own hand. "I do not know Vienna, but I will learn. I will be pleasing." Words that sound like loyalty, but read them again and they tremble like a prayer. Not to God, to survival. The preparations for her departure were endless. 1,000 items packed, tapestries embroidered with the Habsburg crest, Dozens of servants chosen for her entourage, including physicians, wet nurses, music teachers, and one woman who spoke German, to interpret the strange world she was walking into. They began training her body. Tight corsets, long hours standing still, a regulated diet designed not for health, but for appearance. Every day, she practiced walking with a book on her head, smiling on command, drinking wine without coughing, pretending to understand court politics while they measured her hips beneath layers of satin. They even taught her how to weep beautifully, in case Vienna made her cry. But still, she tried to hold on to something. Some nights, she whispered to Ayuda, her dog, and begged him to follow her across the Alps. She cut off a piece of her favorite nightgown and asked her maid to sew it into the lining of her wedding dress. So I will not forget who I was before. One morning, as the carriages were being prepared, she went alone into the royal gardens. A guard found her kneeling by the orange trees. She had buried something. No one knows what it was. The farewell ceremony in Madrid was filled with trumpets and incense. Crowds lined the streets, shouting her name. But her face was still, her steps mechanical. Because in her mind, this was not a parade. It was a funeral. And in a way, it was. As her carriage pulled away from the Escorial, she did not look back, because she knew Margarita of Spain had just died, and now she would become Margaret of Austria. The journey across Europe took 26 days. Rain leaked through the velvet roof of her coach. She was seasick, fevered. At one point, the convoy was stopped by a flash flood, and she had to sleep in a damp stone priory, surrounded by whispers she couldn't understand. At each border, she was greeted with music and bouquets. But she remained silent. One of her ladies-in-waiting later wrote, "The Infanta did not speak for hours at a time. She clutched a letter from His Majesty Leopold and stared out the window until nightfall." The final crossing was the worst. A ceremonial handover at the River Inn, where Spanish and Austrian courts met to exchange her like cargo. She was stripped of her Spanish clothes, even her undergarments, in front of Austrian noblewomen. A symbol. The past must be shed. And she obeyed. She stepped into her new silk dress, pale violet, with the imperial eagle stitched on the hem. When she looked in the mirror, she did not recognize herself. And when she looked at the women around her, tall, blonde, foreign, she no longer even looked like a Habsburg. She was just a womb, wrapped in gold, escorted to a palace, delivered to a man old enough to be her father, and still her blood. The wedding took place in Vienna on a cold December day in 1666. She was 15. Thousands watched as she walked down the aisle of the Augustinian church. Her hands were shaking so badly that the priest had to guide the ring onto her finger. When Leopold lifted her veil, he smiled. She did not. That night, the gates of the Hofburg Palace closed behind them, and history recorded the marriage was consummated. No further details were written, because what more could be said? A girl entered, a queen emerged, and something inside her had already broken. Vienna greeted her with bells, not joyful ones, but slow, drawn-out tolls, meant to echo through cold stone and deeper still into memory. They rang for a wedding. They rang for power. But to Margarita, they rang like warnings. She stepped through the gates of the Hofburg Palace in silence. Behind her, the Alps. Before her, a court she did not understand, ruled not by warmth or welcome, but by protocol, surveillance, and expectation. The Viennese courtiers called her Die Spanisch, the Spanish one. They admired her dresses, her solemn poise, her skin like porcelain. But behind closed doors, they whispered, too foreign, too small, too weak. She was 15 but looked younger. Her voice was high, her posture stiff. She spoke German like a song she had been forced to memorize, one verse at a time. And worst of all, she came alone. None of her Spanish family followed her to Austria. Not her mother, not her beloved dog, not even the priest who had whispered bedtime prayers in Castilian. Just the echo of orders, carried in velvet cases and gold-stitched letters. Obey, produce, endure. Her husband Leopold was 26, awkward, scholarly, deeply devout, and reportedly kind in his way. But kindness cannot replace companionship, and theology cannot ease the loneliness of a child queen. He spoke Latin and German fluently. She answered in hesitant phrases, always careful not to misspeak. At meals, she nodded politely while others spoke over her. At balls, she danced only when summoned. And at night, when the court went quiet, she sat by her bedroom window, watching snow fall onto statues she could not name. Her health began to fail within months. It started with dizziness. Then came the fevers, nosebleeds that stained her pillows. And worst of all, pain in her hips and joints, which she tried to hide, even as it made walking difficult. Doctors were called. They blamed the climate, the stress, the diet. No one dared whisper the real word, degeneration. But the signs were there, the legacy of Habsburg blood. She had the classic features, the long jaw, the thick lower lip, the high forehead. But inside her, centuries of incestuous unions were carving tunnels through her bones, through her fertility, her immunity, her mind. By the time she turned 16, she had suffered 2 miscarriages. No announcement was made. The court simply said, "Her Majesty is resting." And she did, on a bed soaked in blood, surrounded by silent women holding cloths and holy medals. She wrote to her mother, "I remain cheerful in my faith, but I tire easily now. The air here does not like me." That line, "the air does not like me," was more than poetic. It was a quiet confession. This place is killing me, and I am not allowed to say it. The Empress's body was now a political concern. Every meal she ate was monitored, every symptom recorded, every missed cycle speculated on in whispered court gossip. But what no one recorded was her silence. The way she stopped laughing, stopped painting, stopped asking questions. One lady-in-waiting reported that Margarita began talking to herself. Not full conversations, just phrases, repetitions, like prayers or code. "They chose me," she once muttered aloud. "They chose me, and now they forget." Still, she performed her role. She attended Mass. She walked beside Leopold during parades, clutching his arm as if that fragile contact could make her real. She smiled in portraits, though more and more her mouth did not curve upward. Only her eyes widened, almost unnaturally, as if pleading with the viewer. "Do you see me? Am I here?" In one painting by Benjamin Bloch, her cheeks appear slightly flushed. But historians now believe it was artistic correction, meant to hide her paleness, her growing frailty, her thinning skin. Because in truth, Margarita was not blooming. She was wilting, beneath layers of brocade and the gaze of an empire. But there were moments, brief, flickering moments, where the child resurfaced. She found a small garden in the inner courtyard. There, in secret, she planted a Spanish rose bush. Every morning, before sunrise, she would visit it, touching its leaves like a relic of home. She taught one servant to sing her favorite lullaby in Spanish. And sometimes, when she could not sleep, she would whisper it to herself in the dark, as if calling across the continent to the girl she once was. Once a court musician played a tune from Madrid. She turned, startled, and for just a second, she smiled. Not for the emperor, not for the painters, but for herself. That smile didn't last, but it lingered, like a candle lit in a mausoleum. Vienna never accepted her, and she never belonged to it. She was a guest in her own palace, a vessel in a golden cage. By her 17th birthday, the doctors noted her womb remained delicate. They prescribed herbs, fasting, prayers, but all she really needed was to not be here. The empire, however, was not interested in escape. It wanted results. And so, one winter night, the council announced, "Her Majesty is again with child." No one cheered. Not really. Because deep down, even the empire knew each birth was a gamble. And Margarita was running out of pieces to wager. By the time Margarita turned 17, her body was failing faster than her courtiers could hide it. The bright silks she once wore now hung awkwardly off a frame grown too thin, too fragile. Her skin bruised at the lightest touch. Her joints swelled and stiffened. And her eyes, once the curious dark of Spanish twilight, now seemed clouded, as if looking through water. She coughed often. Fever returned like a season. Some mornings, she could not rise without assistance. Some nights, she could not sleep unless someone whispered a prayer beside her until dawn. But the worst of it? The pain. Not sharp like a knife, but dull, spreading, anchored in her spine and womb, dragging her downward with every step. The physicians, 5 of them, rotating like guards, kept diaries. Her Majesty complains of persistent fatigue, swelling noted in the legs and lower abdomen, appetite diminished, pulse irregular, bleeding continues between cycles. They blamed female imbalance, then melancholia, then the cold Austrian wind. But they never blamed what truly haunted her veins: centuries of incestuous blood. The Habsburgs had long chased purity, marrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, niece to uncle, until their bodies no longer obeyed the laws of nature. And Margarita? She was the end of that line, the final bloom on a branch strangling itself. There were whispers now, not just about her health, but about her usefulness. Courtiers asked, will she survive the next pregnancy? If she dies, who shall replace her? Can the emperor marry again? And though no one said it aloud, the implication echoed louder each week. A queen who cannot bear sons is a fading investment. Leopold remained faithful, at least publicly. He visited her chambers, held her hand during Mass. But as she grew weaker, their connection thinned. It was not cruelty, it was resignation. The slow distancing of a man preparing to lose something he cannot fix. In her private chamber, Margarita began recording her own symptoms. Small entries, folded pages tucked beneath her prayer book. Bleeding again. Cannot walk far today. Missed the garden this week. I dreamed of Madrid. Those notes were not for medicine. They were for memory. As if she feared one day she would forget herself completely, reduced to a body and a womb on a deathbed no one would admit was forming. Sometimes she screamed, not in rage, but in frustration, confusion, terror, especially at night. Servants heard her crying out during fevers, delirious, begging for her mother, for Ayuda, for light. At other times, she would lie silent, lips moving as if in prayer, but her eyes glassed over, unfocused. One morning, a maid found her collapsed on the marble floor, skin cold, pulse faint, blood pooling from her nose. She survived, but barely. The incident was never spoken of publicly. They simply wrote, "The Empress rests." But inside the palace, they began preparing a different kind of dress, a burial gown. Yet amidst the decay, duty persisted. A new pregnancy was confirmed, a fourth. The emperor's advisors were ecstatic. They spoke of hope, legacy, continuity. But Margarita, she said nothing. When told the news, she simply closed her eyes. Her lady-in-waiting reported she whispered, "I hope it is quick." In the months that followed, her condition worsened. She could no longer walk unaided. Swelling in her legs became severe. Her fingers stiffened to the point she could not hold a quill. And yet, she was still paraded, dragged in formal procession, wrapped in velvet and jewels, painted again and again by artists instructed to show strength in her expression. In one portrait from this period, her face looks ghost-like. The cheeks are hollow, the neck frail, and the eyes, wide, wet, and distant, no longer seem to belong to the living. What haunted her most wasn't death. It was being forgotten. She once asked her confessor, "When I am gone, will they remember I ever lived outside this palace?" He told her, "Your son will remember you. Your name will endure." But a name is not a life, and a child cannot remember what he was born to bury. Sometimes she would ask for paintings of Spain, or request someone hum Spanish lullabies. Other times, she would simply stare into the fireplace, whispering, "I am still here. I am still here." As if she feared even the walls might forget. Her final months before childbirth were spent mostly in bed. Her belly grew heavy, but not with joy, with dread. Because she knew, this time, her body would not endure. And still, she tried to smile, to pray, to breathe. But each breath sounded more like a countdown, to something inevitable, to something grotesque, to something the empire had demanded, and she could no longer deny. There were mirrors everywhere in the Hofburg Palace. Tall ones, oval ones, silver-framed and cold. At first, Margarita had admired them. A foreign princess trapped in a foreign court. These reflections gave her back something of herself. Her face, her eyes, the outline of someone real. But over time, the mirrors began to betray her. They didn't lie. They told the truth too clearly. She saw her skin, paler than before, almost translucent. She saw her lips, once full, now cracked and dry. She saw her eyes, no longer hers, but those of her painted portraits, wide and too alert. Sometimes when she passed a mirror, she'd pause, not to admire, not to adjust her dress, but because she was startled. She would flinch, like a child seeing a ghost, because what stared back was not a queen, not even a girl, but a mask. And worse still, sometimes the mirrors moved. She said this to no one. But one night, she told her chambermaid, "I walked past my mirror and I swear, it turned to look at me." The physicians called it fatigue of the spirit. They prescribed sleep, lavender water, whispered prayers. The priests called it temptation, a test from God. They urged her to fast more, confess more, believe more. But faith did not help, not anymore. In the halls, she began to hear footsteps, behind her, though no one was there. In the nursery, she claimed to hear a baby crying, though her child had not yet been born. In her sleep, she muttered in Spanish, frantic, repetitive phrases. "Where is my mother? Where is my name?" The servants were frightened, and so they became silent, obedient, but distant, because madness was contagious, especially in royalty. Leopold visited her less. At first, he brought flowers, books, news from court, but then only short visits. Then only letters, and finally, only rumors. She began to believe he was seeing other women. She began to believe he wanted her dead. One morning, she refused her medicine, accused the midwife of poison, demanded the room be searched for spirits. The emperor was informed. He ordered her to rest, and she did, staring at the ceiling for hours, whispering things only the walls could hear. The portraits didn't help. Every room held images of her, painted as a child, a bride, a queen. The same face, copied again and again, like a saint without a story. She hated them, then pitied them, then feared them. She claimed one painting blinked at her. Another, she said, whispered, "You are replaceable." When she told her confessor this, he asked gently, "Do you believe your soul is intact, my child?" And she replied, "I'm not sure my body ever was." Once, during a thunderstorm, she tried to run. Not far, just out. She made it halfway down the marble corridor before collapsing, barefoot, breathless, weeping. Her hair was soaked, her voice cracked. She clutched the stone like it could swallow her whole. They carried her back, but something in her didn't return. From then on, she refused all mirrors. She had them covered in black cloth. She demanded no one paint her. She would not be frozen again. She would not be multiplied. Instead, she took to sitting in a small corner of her chamber where the candlelight couldn't reach the walls. There she rocked slightly, murmured old stories from Spain, and waited. There were moments, brief, glimmering, where sanity returned, where she asked for letters from home, where she laughed faintly at a joke from a servant, where she remembered herself not as empress, but as a girl who once planted a rose bush and named it after her nurse. But those moments never stayed. They came like birds, then flew. As her belly swelled with the new child, so did her fear. Not of motherhood, not of death, but of disappearance. "When I go," she whispered once, "they will paint someone else over me." Her lady-in-waiting assured her, "You are the empress. You will never be forgotten." But Margarita shook her head and said the line that would be remembered in secret for generations. Empires remember portraits, not the pain that made them. In her final weeks before labor, she began drawing circles in ink. Dozens of them, on pages, on linen, on her sheets. When asked what they meant, she answered, "It's how my family married." Round and round, until we disappeared. The doctors now feared for her mind, but no one dared intervene, not in public, not officially. To call the Empress mad was to admit the empire was cracked, so they nodded and wrote nothing. But they watched her closely, waited, prepared, because something was coming, not just the child, but the end. It began before dawn. The chambermaids lit candles along the walls, one by one, as the scent of wax mixed with the sharpness of iron and blood. Outside, Vienna was sleeping under snow. Inside, the Empress screamed. The first contraction came like thunder, ripping through her frail body with no warning. She gripped the edge of her bedding until her knuckles turned white. The midwives rushed in. The doctor, already waiting in the hall, crossed himself before entering, because everyone knew this would not be clean, and it would not be kind. Margarita's face was soaked in sweat within minutes. She clenched her jaw, bit her lip until it bled. Every breath was a war between pain and pride, between the girl still inside her and the queen they had demanded she become. The child was not coming easily. He was large. She was small, too small. Her pelvis, narrow and malformed by generations of inbreeding, was not built to deliver life. It was built for paintings, for appearances, for lineage, and now it was breaking her open. The sheets beneath her turned crimson. They whispered for towels, for hot water, for holy relics. Someone brought a crucifix. Someone else brought smelling salts. But nothing could quiet her cries, cries that echoed through the stone corridor like the final aria of a dying saint. One servant fainted. Another vomited behind the door. Still, the physicians worked, prying, cutting, praying. "Push," they begged, "for the empire, Your Majesty. Push for the child." But she wasn't pushing for the empire. She was screaming for herself. Because deep down, Margarita knew, if the baby lived, she would not. The pain came in waves now, crashing against her spine, her hips, her lungs. She tore at the sheets. Her fingernails broke. Her lips split from the dryness of gasping. She begged for water, then for her mother. Then, in a hoarse whisper, "Let me go. Let me go. Let me go." But no one could, because too much had been invested. Too many crowns depended on her womb. She was no longer a person. She was the gate, and they would force that gate open if it killed her. Hours passed. The blood would not stop. The child had crowned, but could not exit. Her body convulsed. Her pupils dilated. She lost consciousness twice, and still they pushed her upright. Still, they urged her on. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the firelight, beyond the screams, a church bell rang, not for her, but for morning mass. And in that moment, as her body tore, Margarita Teresa saw the Virgin Mary on the ceiling, not weeping, not glowing, watching. With one final cry, sharp, gurgling, almost inhuman, the child was born, a boy, bloody, large, alive. The court erupted in relief. The midwife smiled. One doctor declared, "The Archduke is strong, the line will endure." But the Empress? She was silent. Her breathing had slowed. Her skin had turned gray. She was hemorrhaging internally. her uterus torn beyond repair. The doctors whispered, argued, panicked. They tried to stitch, to press, to bleed her further in hopes of restoring balance. But it was too late. Her eyes fluttered, her head tilted, and from her mouth came one final whisper, "Do not paint me like this." Then, nothing. At just 21 years old, Margarita Teresa of Spain, Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, died in her bed. Not with a crown, not in ceremony, but in blood, in silence, in ruin. The room was cleared, the sheets were burned, the corpse washed and wrapped, and within the hour, a portrait artist was summoned. Because if she could no longer breathe, she would still be made to smile. The baby, Joseph, was taken away. He would live. He would be crowned. And history would remember him. But her name would become a line in a family tree. Her portrait, a decorative piece. Her story, a warning no one dared write. Because in royal courts, death during childbirth was not tragedy. It was cost. And Margarita Teresa had paid in full. The bells of Vienna did not toll when she died. They waited, not out of mourning, but out of protocol. The death of an empress had to be announced formally, delicately, once the child's health was confirmed, once the physicians had signed, once the court had written the words, "Her Majesty passed peacefully." But it wasn't peaceful, and everyone who had stood in that room knew it. The child, Joseph, survived, red-faced, wailing, alive. They wrapped him in white silk embroidered with gold, not to honor the mother who birthed him, but to declare him the future. Leopold held the child with gloved hands. He looked at the boy's eyes, dark, alert, so much like hers. He said nothing. He did not weep. The ministers offered congratulations. The clergy offered blessings. The court offered silence. Because in the calculus of empire, a queen lost and a prince gained was not a tragedy. It was a transaction. Margarita's body was prepared in the way all royal corpses are. Washed in rosewater, perfumed, wrapped in layers of satin. They painted her cheeks, curled her hair, folded her hands over her belly as if it had not been torn open hours before. The death mask was made within 24 hours. It captured her mouth half open, her eyelids heavy. But they touched it up. They always did. They softened the jawline. They erased the blood vessels on her temples. Because even in death, she was expected to look pleasing. She was placed in a glass coffin, not for mourning, for display. Courtiers filed past, bowing their heads. Some crossed themselves, some just stared. A few whispered prayers, others calculations. Will Leopold remarry? Will the boy inherit the Spanish crown as well? They admired the embroidery on her burial gown. They commented on how peaceful she looked. None mentioned the screams. None mentioned the blood. Leopold visited her once, alone. No record was kept of what he said, if anything. No priest was present, only a servant who stood by the door and later reported, "He looked at her for a long time, then he left, and he never spoke her name again." The funeral was magnificent. Music thundered through the cathedral, incense clouded the air. Nobles in black lace and gold buttons filled the pews. They called her faithful, pious, a noble daughter of Spain. They did not call her child bride. They did not call her sacrifice. They did not say she died from a womb that was never meant to bear kings. They buried her in the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church, where generations of Habsburgs lay in ornate metal coffins side by side, as if eternity were a banquet hall. Her tomb was engraved with her titles: Empress, wife, mother. Not a single word about the pain, not a single word about her. And the empire moved on. Leopold remarried within 2 years. His second wife was older, stronger, more fit for bearing heirs. She gave him more children. She survived. Joseph, the son Margarita died to bring into the world, was raised by governesses, tutors, wet nurses. He grew strong, intelligent, austere. They told him he was born for greatness. They told him his bloodline was blessed. But no one told him about the girl in the coffin. No one told him how hard she fought to get him here. When he asked about his mother, they said, she was a fine empress, very devout. Nothing more. Because the crown remembers itself, but not the head it once crushed. And so, Margarita Teresa of Spain became what so many royal women become: a shadow behind a throne, a vessel emptied, a name carved into stone, while her body rotted in silence. The rose bush she once planted in the palace garden withered the following spring. No one tended it. The mirrors in her room were uncovered, reused. The portraits remained on the walls, but no one looked at them the same, because she wasn't there anymore. Not really. Just an image. Just another girl with gold in her name and blood on her wedding dress. They called her an empress, but over time, history began to strip that title away, layer by layer, until what remained was not a queen, not a mother, not a woman, but a body. A body they debated, a body they painted, a body they used, then buried, then forgot. And now, centuries later, the arguments begin again. Some historians call her a tragic necessity, the final knot in a rope tied by centuries of Habsburg policy. A political offering, a bridge between two crumbling empires. They say she fulfilled her purpose. She bore a son. She gave an heir. She upheld the dynasty. That was enough. She died. Yes, but death was always the risk. In royal childbirth, death was the price of legacy. She was not the first. She was not the last. And so they write her name in clean Latin on family trees: Margarita Teresa Hispaniarum Filia, Uxor Leopoldi Imperatoris, and move on. But others, fewer, quieter, refuse to let her be footnoted. They look at her portraits and see not just a queen in lace, but a prisoner in layers of velvet and silence. They see the swollen eyes, the stiff posture, the tension in her small shoulders, holding up a dynasty far too heavy for her frame. They look at the letters she wrote as a child. I will try to be pleasing. I hope Vienna is kind. And they ask, what kind of world teaches a 9-year-old to write like that? They see her as a sacrificial lamb, an innocent offered on the altar of imperial inbreeding, not for love, not even for loyalty, but for survival. And her death? They do not call it a complication. They call it a consequence. There are also those who reduce her to biology. In medical journals, Margarita Teresa is a case study, an early, well-documented victim of Habsburg genetic collapse. They analyze her symptoms. Hydrocephalus suspected. reproductive organ malformations, chronic fatigue likely due to metabolic instability, narrow pelvis leading to fatal labor. They use words like morphological markers, familial degeneration, dynastic end stage. Her name becomes part of a chart, her face, a diagram. And once again, the person is erased beneath the data. But the worst forgetting is the one that wears a crown. Modern royal historians praise Leopold. They praise Joseph, her son. They praise the Habsburgs for enduring. And when Margarita's name comes up, they offer lines like, "Her sacrifice was noble. She passed in the service of empire. She lives on through her son." But how can one live on when every part of you is bent, broken, and burned into ash to keep someone else on a throne? Is legacy a life? Is bloodline a consolation for the body that bore it? There are no surviving letters from Margarita in her final days, just fragments, just whispers from those who tended her, and paintings, dozens of them. In one painted after her death, she is depicted with a halo. Her eyes look to heaven. A baby lies at her feet. The title? The Empress Transfigured. But she was not transfigured. She was bled out on a linen bed, her screams muffled by incense and ceremony. There was no miracle, only decay. And yet, some try to redeem the silence. In recent years, essays have appeared, podcasts, biographies with titles like The Lost Empress, The Girl Who Birthed a Crown. Some Spanish scholars demand her body be returned to Madrid. Others ask that the Vienna crypt be marked with her story, not just her name. One historian writes, "She was not a mother. She was made into one. She was not a martyr. She was manufactured. She was not forgotten. She was erased, intentionally, efficiently, and royally." And so, the debate continues. Was Margarita Teresa a queen who died young? Or a girl who was never allowed to live? Was her death a failure of medicine? Or the inevitable conclusion of a system that treated women as wombs? Was she noble? Or just numb? Some say we should stop asking, that centuries have passed, that she would not want us to pry. But perhaps it's not about what she would want. Perhaps it's about what she deserved, not sainthood, not pity, but acknowledgement. That beneath the lace and lineage, there was a person who laughed once, who cried often, who tried to bloom in soil too shallow, and whose body, still lying in Vienna, asks a question no empire has ever answered honestly. What did you build on top of me? And why was it worth my life? She never got to choose how she would be remembered. But others chose for her. Painters, courtiers, clerics. They lifted their brushes, their quills, their chisels, and fashioned her into something easier to accept, easier to forget. They called her serene. They called her holy. They called her pure. They never called her broken. The final portrait came weeks after her death. It was commissioned not by family, not by those who had heard her scream, but by ministers of state, to hang in the imperial hall, to be placed alongside other empresses as if she had lived a full reign. In the painting, she wears a silver gown. Her hands are folded gracefully. A crown sits beside her, not on her head, but gently placed like an afterthought. And her expression, serene, almost smiling. The artist softened the hollows beneath her eyes, raised her cheeks just slightly, added a gentle blush to her lips. But no one asked, what color were her lips the night she died? Behind her in the portrait is a window. Through it, light pours into the room. It is meant to symbolize heaven, salvation, peace. But that light never touched her in life. Her chambers in Vienna were dark, her bed curtains drawn to keep the cold from her bones. And in her final days, she begged for fire. She didn't want heaven. She wanted warmth. They placed the painting in the Hofburg, high above eye level, so no one could stare too long at her expression. Beneath it, a brass plaque. It read, Margarita Teresa of Austria, 1651 to 1673. Empress consort to Leopold I, mother of Joseph Thurs. May she rest in glory. There was no mention of the fever, no mention of the blood, no mention of the fact she was once a child playing with dolls in Madrid, now frozen in a gilded frame, forever dignified. But paintings were not the only place she lingered. Deep beneath the streets of Vienna, in the Kapuziner Gruft, the imperial crypt, her body remains, encased in a dark bronze sarcophagus, engraved with Baroque vines and Latin inscriptions. Visitors walk past it every day. Few stop. Fewer still know what lies inside. If they read the inscription, they see only Margarita Teresa, Imperatrix. The coffin is cold, heavier than it should be, and over the centuries, its metal has tarnished, but not nearly as quickly as memory. She lies beside others, emperors, children, brides, all reduced to identical silence. But none of them died the way she did, and none of them were painted to cover it up. There are no flowers left at her tomb, no candles, no photographs, just dust and a plaque, and the echo of something once called a life. Back in Spain, a few of her childhood paintings still hang in the Prado. In one, she is only 5, dressed in white, her dog Ayuda by her side. She stares forward, uncertain, one hand curled into a fist, the other limp. At first glance, it's sweet, innocent. But look longer, and you see it. The weight already there. In her tiny shoulders, in her unsmiling lips. She looks like a girl holding her breath, as if she already knew what was coming. There is no statue of her in Madrid, no street named in her honor, no palace wing dedicated to her memory. She gave birth to a future emperor. And yet, the empire gave her no monument, except for that final portrait, painted to be admired, to be passed by, to say, she was beautiful, she was noble, she died well. But she didn't. The portrait still hangs today. Tourists walk past it. They admire the brushwork. They compliment the symmetry. Some even say, she looks like a saint. But saints are chosen. Saints are venerated. Saints ascend. Margarita did not. She was chosen by others, venerated in silence, and buried beneath the weight of a crown too large for her skull. If she could speak now, if that painting could peel itself open and let her out, what would she say? Would she ask for justice? No, she'd ask for acknowledgement that the smile wasn't real, that the crown was too heavy, that her womb was not an altar, but a battlefield, and that her portrait, however lovely, was never the whole story. She never ruled a nation. She never won a war. She never spoke before a court or led an army. And yet, Margarita Teresa of Spain became the spine of two empires, not through strength, not through voice, but through obedience, through compliance, through a silence that echoed louder than any decree. She was not powerful, she was necessary. And in the architecture of power, necessity has always been the most disposable brick. We remember kings who built cities, queens who wrote letters, princes who rebelled. But what about the ones who never had the chance to become anything at all? The daughters promised at birth, the brides exported like treaties, the girls who learned to bleed under a painted ceiling and died before they ever learned who they were. What do we call them? Not martyrs, not heroes, not monsters. Ghosts, soft ghosts, with hair pinned just so, and hands always folded in their laps. Margarita was not forgotten by accident. She was erased by design, because her story is inconvenient. It reminds us that behind every golden cradle was a girl who had no choice, that behind every empire's rise was a bedroom soaked in blood. Her portraits remain, but they have no voice. Her son ruled, but never knew her. Her tomb stands, but says nothing. And maybe that's why we need to tell this story again. Not to resurrect her, but to refuse the forgetting. Because this is not just about a Habsburg bride. This is about every life bent for the will of something bigger, something colder, something that feeds on obedience and calls it destiny. She was born into silk, died in pain, and was wrapped in gold one final time to hide the ruin beneath. Her womb gave birth to a king. Her mouth was shut before she could ever speak like one. And still, they call her lucky. Still, they paint her smiling. But behind that smile is a girl whispering, "I wanted more. I was alive once. Please don't forget the truth." So we say her name, not as a title, not as a footnote, but as a story. Margarita Teresa, the girl who was born for a crown, married to her uncle, broken by birth, killed by motherhood, and embalmed by silence. We don't tell her story to change history. We tell it to unmask it, because when history puts a veil over pain, it becomes myth, and myths protect power. But stories, real stories, protect the dead. So if you ever walk past her portrait or stand above the stone that hides her bones, pause. Look closer. Not at the dress, not at the crown, not at the title, but at the girl underneath. You'll see it, if you look long enough. The clenched jaw, the wide eyes, the echo of a scream still trapped in the paint. And if you listen, you might hear her say, "I was not a queen. I was a girl, and you let them turn me into a vessel. But now, I am more than that. I am remembered." In the end, Margarita Teresa was not destroyed by war or scandal, but by the quiet violence of expectation. She was consumed not in a battlefield, but in a bridal chamber. Her enemies were not soldiers, but customs, tradition, bloodlines. And that, perhaps, is the most tragic death of all. To vanish while fulfilling the very role you were told would make you eternal. They praised her for her purity, but that purity poisoned her. They honored her obedience, but that obedience buried her. Her voice was never recorded, but her silence still echoes. And in that silence, we must ask ourselves, how many women throughout history were remembered only for what they gave, and never for who they were?